On August 14, 2024, a seasonal forestry worker named Elias Thorne was navigating a nameless tributary of the upper Skeena River, clearing deadfall left by an unusually aggressive spring thaw. The water was low, exposing the skeletal remains of ancient cedar drifts and river stones that had been submerged for a decade. It was here, wedged deep within a limestone crevice 5 feet above the current waterline, that he saw a flash of synthetic orange. It was a rugged industrial-grade dry bag, its surface caked in a fine silt that had hardened into a ceramic-like shell. Inside, preserved in a vacuum of frozen time, was a high-end DSLR camera. The memory card was still seated in its slot. The data was intact. This was the beginning of the end for a mystery that had haunted the Pacific Northwest since the summer of 2014. The camera belonged to Julian Vane. In the early autumn of 2014, Julian Vane was not a man anyone expected to disappear. He was a veteran whitewater kayaker, a structural engineer by trade, and a man whose life was defined by the mitigation of risk. His gear was never second-rate. His itineraries were always filed with 3 separate contacts. He carried a satellite messenger, a topographical map printed on waterproof polyart, and enough emergency rations to last a week. He was the expert victim, the individual whose very competence makes their absence an impossibility. When he set out for a solo 5-day expedition through the unmapped veins of the northern wilderness, he wasn't seeking a thrill. He was seeking a technical challenge he had spent 20 years preparing for. The mountains do not care for preparation. They do not acknowledge a resume. Julian's vehicle was found 4 days after he was reported overdue, parked neatly at the trailhead of a decommissioned logging road. There was no sign of struggle. His logbook sat on the dashboard. The last entry dated September 12, 2014 at 6:45 a.m. It read, "Flow rates optimal, water temp 42 degrees, pushing off now." No signal, no trace, just silence. For 10 years, the case remained a static void in the provincial archives. Search and rescue operations had logged over 400 man-hours in the weeks following his disappearance, utilizing FLIR-equipped helicopters and K-9 units trained for cadaver recovery. They found nothing. No scrap of polyethylene from his kayak, no shred of his distinctive blue dry suit. The river was searched until the winter freeze made further efforts a lethal gamble for the rescuers. The Vane family eventually held a memorial, but the lack of a body meant the grieving process was stuck in a state of permanent suspension. They were left to wonder how a man who accounted for every variable could be erased so completely. The mountains keep their secrets, and for a decade, Julian Vane was one of them. The discovery of the camera changed the nature of the tragedy from a disappearance to a forensic reconstruction. When the digital files were recovered by the investigative team, they found 142 photographs and 3 video clips. The metadata provided a hauntingly precise timeline of Julian's final hours. This was the evidence log of a dying man. The first 40 photos are breathtaking. They show a man in total command of his environment. Macro shots of moss-covered stones, wide-angle vistas of the river canyon, and several self-timer portraits of Julian. In these images, he looks calm. He is wearing his helmet, his life jacket is cinched tight, and his kayak is rigged with the precision of a professional. At 10:14 a.m. on September 12th, Julian takes a photo of a peculiar rock formation known locally as the Throat. It is a narrow bottleneck where the river accelerates through a gap barely 6 feet wide. This is the last photo of the river as a place of beauty. The next image, time-stamped 11:22 a.m., is a forensic image of a disaster in progress. The camera was likely triggered by a jolt. The frame is blurred, but you can see the white explosion of water against a dark submerged object. A sweeper. In river terminology, a sweeper is a fallen tree that hangs just above or below the water surface, acting like a sieve. It allows water through but traps anything solid. Julian's kayak, a vessel built for speed and stability, had been pinned. Imagine you are standing on that riverbank, the sound of the water a constant deafening roar that drowns out your own pulse. You are miles from the nearest human being. Your boat, your primary means of transport, and your primary flotation device is being crushed by several tons of hydraulic pressure. You have seconds to react. At 11:24 a.m., Julian Vane is no longer a kayaker, he is a survivor. The photographs taken after this point lose their artistic composition. They become functional. They are the record of a man trying to solve a problem that has no solution. At 12:05 p.m., there is a photo of his GPS unit. The screen shows his coordinates, but more importantly, it shows a no signal icon. The deep canyon walls, rich in iron ore, had created a natural dead zone. The satellite messenger he relied on was useless. The irony is staggering. The very geography he came to admire had conspired to isolate him. He was trapped in a topographical shadow. At 1:40 p.m., the first video clip begins. It is only 12 seconds long. The camera is resting on a flat stone. Julian is visible in the frame, sitting on the muddy bank. He is wet, but he has managed to start a small fire. He doesn't speak to the camera. He is looking at his hands, which are shaking with the early stages of hypothermia. He is performing a gear check. He lays out his remaining items: a whistle, a multi-tool, a half-empty bag of trail mix, and a silver emergency blanket. This list is the humanization of the mundane. These are the artifacts of a life reduced to the barest essentials. Why would he stay by the river? The grieving investigator asked this question a decade later, looking at the maps. The nearest road was only 4 miles away as the crow flies, but those 4 miles consisted of vertical Devil's Club and ancient growth forest that moved at a pace of half a mile per hour for a healthy man. In Julian's condition, it was a fortress. At 4:15 p.m., the light begins to fail. The canyon walls ensure that sunset comes 2 hours early. Julian takes a photo of the sky. It is a leaden, bruised gray. The mountains don't explain why the weather turned that afternoon, but the records show a sudden drop in pressure. A localized storm cell was moving in. At 6:30 p.m., the last photo of the first day is taken. It is a macro shot of the emergency blanket, the crinkled silver foil reflecting the dying embers of his fire. It is an image of profound loneliness. The rule of irony dictates that the more Julian tried to stay prepared, the more the environment stripped his advantages away. He had the fire, he had the blanket, but he did not have the heat. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, and his dry suit, though waterproof, was not insulated for an overnight stay in a damp canyon. At 3:45 a.m. on September 13th, the camera is activated again. There is no image, only a black frame, but the audio captures the sound of the storm. The wind is funneled through the canyon, creating a low rhythmic thrumming. You can hear Julian coughing. It is a wet, heavy sound. The mountains keep their secrets, but the camera captures the onset of pneumonia. At 7:02 a.m., the first light of day 2 reveals a transformed landscape. The river has risen 4 inches due to the rain. The kayak, which had been Julian's only hope of salvage, is gone. It has been swept away or sucked under by the increased volume of the river. The camera captures the empty space where the orange polyethylene used to be. No boat, no signal, no trace, just the rising water. The pacing of the evidence now begins to accelerate, reflecting the frantic nature of a man who knows his window of opportunity is closing. Julian begins to move. He decides to climb. The photographs from mid-morning on September 13th show the vertical ascent. Macro shots of dirt, moss, and bark as he hauls himself up the canyon wall. He is seeking a signal. He is seeking the sun. But the higher he goes, the more the GPS drift complicates his narrative. The metadata shows his elevation increasing, but his horizontal coordinates are erratic. He is lost in a vertical maze of slick rock and loose scree. At 11:50 a.m., he reaches a ledge. He takes a panoramic shot. From this height, the river looks like a silver thread, beautiful and indifferent. He is looking down at his own grave, though he doesn't know it yet. Why would he climb so high with a lung infection? The open-loop question remains. Perhaps he thought the summit would offer a clear line of sight for his satellite messenger. Perhaps he simply wanted to die in the sun rather than the shadows. At 2:10 p.m., the second video clip is recorded. Julian's voice is a raspy whisper. "If you find this," he says, his breath misting in the cold air, "tell Sarah I tried. The ledge is too slick. I can't get back down and I can't go further up." He turns the camera to show his boots. One of them is missing. He had lost it in a fall, his foot now wrapped in a tattered piece of the emergency blanket. The mountains don't explain why a man of his experience would lose a boot, but the forensic evidence of the ledge shows a recent rock slide. The ground literally gave way beneath him. He was a structural engineer who had finally encountered a structure he couldn't calculate. At 5 p.m., the final sequence of photos begins. These are the most haunting images in the collection. They are not photos of the landscape. They are photos of his own equipment, laid out in a neat professional row on the ledge. His watch, his compass, his wedding ring. He was cataloging his life, preparing a discovery for whoever would eventually find him. He was maintaining his professionalism until the very end. The last photo, taken at 6:12 p.m. on September 13, 2014, is a shot of the horizon. The sun is a sliver of gold on the edge of the world. It is a beautiful, cruel image. Then the camera is turned off. It is placed back inside the dry bag. The seal is checked. The bag is tethered to a small, stunted pine tree growing from a crack in the rock. Julian Vane had ensured that while he might disappear, his story would not. He sat on that ledge, 800 feet above the river, and waited for the end. The mountains keep their secrets, but for Julian, the secret was finally out. He had done everything right, and it hadn't mattered. That is the haunting reality of the wilderness. It is not a character, it is a vacuum. It doesn't hate you, but it will never love you back. The grieving investigator now looks at the final resting place, a spot that wouldn't be reached by human feet for another decade. The tree Julian tied the bag to eventually died, its roots losing their grip in a massive storm in 2022. The bag fell, tumbling down the cliff face, bouncing off the limestone and landing in the tributary where it remained until the spring thaw of 2024. It was a journey of 10 years and 800 feet. The camera survived the fall, the man did not. When the search teams returned to the coordinates found in the camera's metadata, they finally found him. He was still on the ledge, or what was left of him. A decade of winters had reduced the expert victim to a collection of weathered objects and silver foil. They found the single boot first, then they found the ring. The reconstruction was complete. The narrative truth had been pulled from the silt and the rust. As the helicopter lifted the remains from the canyon, a static-filled archival footage from the original 2014 search played on the evening news, a stark contrast to the high-definition clarity of the photos Julian had left behind. The moral warning is clear to anyone who steps into the green cathedrals of the North. Preparation is a comfort, not a guarantee. You can pack the best gear, you can map every rapid, and you can calculate every risk, but the river has no memory of your efforts. Julian Vane was a man of science who was undone by the indifferent math of gravity and cold. The mountains don't explain why, and they never will. The file structure of the recovered SD card revealed a secondary partition, one Julian had encrypted using a basic firmware utility common among engineers of his era. This wasn't just a collection of vacation photos, it was a digital black box. When the forensic analysts bypassed the encryption on October 2, 2024, they uncovered a series of voice memos recorded into the camera's internal microphone during the final 48 hours. These recordings represent the narrative truth in its rawest, most agonizing form. At 8:15 p.m. on September 13th, the first memo begins. The sound of the wind is gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollow stillness. Julian's voice is no longer a whisper. It is a clinical observation of his own body's failure. He describes the sensation of the squeeze, a term used by high-altitude climbers to describe the tightening of the chest as the lungs fill with fluid. He notes his pulse, 110 beats per minute, thready and irregular. He is narrating his own transition from a living subject to a forensic specimen. Imagine you are sitting in that darkness. the silver blanket draped over your shoulders like a shroud that won't stop crinkling. Every breath is a conscious effort, a mechanical task that your brain must initiate because the autonomic systems are shutting down. Julian spent 40 minutes talking about the physics of the fall that trapped him. He wasn't crying. He was analyzing the friction coefficients of the wet limestone. He was trying to understand why he failed. The expert victim cannot simply accept a mistake. They must solve it, even if the solution is found only in the moments before death. At 11:30 p.m., the tone shifts. The analytical distance breaks. He begins to talk to the grieving investigator, though he does not know who we are yet. He speaks to the people who will find the bag. He gives instructions on how to settle his estate. He mentions a specific drawer in his office where the life insurance policy is kept. He is being a husband and a citizen, even as he is being reclaimed by the earth. This is the evidence log of a soul. The mundane details of a mortgage and a car payment are spoken into the void of a canyon that has existed for 6 million years. The mountains keep their secrets, but they allow Julian this one final act of domesticity. At 2 a.m. on September 14th, the temperature on the ledge hits 28 degrees. The camera's thermal sensor, recorded in the metadata, shows the steady decline of the ambient heat. Julian records a memo that is only 3 words long. It is beautiful. He does not elaborate. He does not describe the stars or the moon. He leaves the open loop for us to fill. What did he see in that final frozen clarity? The rhetorical echo of the wilderness suggests that at the end, the terror gives way to a profound chemical peace. Hypothermia is a deceptive killer. It tricks the mind into feeling warm, leading victims to remove their clothing in a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. Julian, however, did not succumb to this. The forensic recovery showed his layers were perfectly intact, his jacket zipped to the chin. He fought the instinct to unravel. He remained an engineer until the electrical signals in his heart finally ceased. The second batch of evidence moves into the discovery phase of the physical gear found scattered below the ledge. In July of 2025, a secondary recovery team used ground-penetrating radar to scan the ski slope. They found the expert victim's most prized possession, his custom-made carbon fiber paddle. It had been snapped in 3 places. The brakes were clean, indicating a massive lateral force, the kind of force generated by a hydraulic hole in a grade 5 rapid. This paddle was the extension of Julian's own arms. Seeing it shattered was the physical manifestation of his broken agency. Nearby, buried under 6 inches of sediment, was a waterproof container of strike-anywhere matches. Not one had been struck. He had the means to create fire, but by the time he reached the ledge, the shivering had become so violent that he lacked the fine motor skills to ignite them. This is the rule of irony in its most crystalline form. The tool that could have saved him sat 3 inches from his hand, useless because his hand had forgotten how to be a hand. The grieving investigator notes that the matches were still dry enough to light 10 years later. The mountains don't explain why a man is given the tools for survival only to have the ability to use them stripped away. The pacing of the investigation in 2025 mirrored the methodical slow burn of Julian's final hours. Each item pulled from the dirt was a timestamp of a life. A watch stopped at 4:12, a compass with a cracked bezel, a dehydrated meal packet, unopened. The evidence log grows longer, and with each entry, the mystery of Julian Vane becomes less about how he died and more about the dignity with which he accepted it. The documentary essayist looks at the flashbulb transitions of the crime scene photos, the stark white light of the forensics team's strobes illuminating the dark corners of the canyon. We see macro shots of the rust on his multi-tool, a jagged orange crust eating away at the stainless steel. We see the static-filled archival footage of his kayak being pulled from a logjam 3 miles downstream in late 2024, a mangled husk of plastic that looks like a piece of modern art. The narrative truth is that Julian Vane did not vanish. He was simply moved from one state of matter to another. He was integrated into the canyon. His breath became the condensation on the rocks. His gear became part of the river's sediment. The impossible discovery of the camera was the river's way of returning what it could no longer use. At 5 a.m. on September 14, 2014, the camera recorded its final piece of data. It wasn't a photo or a video, it was a system error log. The battery had reached a critical low and the internal clock began to drift. The metadata shows the camera trying to maintain its sense of time, a digital heart beating in the dark. It is the last heartbeat of the expedition. Imagine you are the investigator holding this camera 10 years later. You are scrolling through the images, the slow pans over weathered objects reflecting in your eyes. You see the transition from the vibrant orange of the kayak to the muted silver of the emergency blanket. You see the light fading. You see the expert victim becoming the expert witness to his own end. Why did he keep the camera inside the bag? Why not use the last of the battery to signal with a flash? Perhaps he knew that in the vastness of the Skeena wilderness, a flash of light is just another star, and a star is too far away to help. He chose the narrative truth over a futile gesture. He chose to be remembered accurately rather than searched for indefinitely. The grieving investigator finds a strange comfort in this. There is justice through memory in the fact that Julian's final thoughts were preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag. The mountains keep their secrets, but they couldn't keep this one. The camera is a bridge across a decade of silence. As the second phase of the reconstruction draws to a close, we are left with the physical remains of a man who was defined by his preparation. We see the forensic casual reality of the situation. The GPS coordinates of the ledge are now etched into the official record. The void has been filled with data, but data is not the same as peace. The open loop remains for Sarah, the woman Julian mentioned in his final video. For 10 years, she lived in a world where Julian simply ceased to exist. Now she lives in a world where he is trapped forever on a ledge in a 12-second video clip. Which is worse? The narrative structure of this tragedy suggests that knowing the end is a burden all its own. The grieving investigator watches the video for the 100th time, looking for a clue in the background, a shadow that shouldn't be there, a sign of what Julian was looking at when he said, "It is beautiful." There is nothing but the gray rock and the white mist. The mountains don't explain why beauty is the final emotion of the dying. They simply provide the backdrop. The camera is now evidence in a closed case, a relic of a decade-long wait. The forensic storytelling has reached its midpoint. We have the man, we have the gear, and we have the final words. But we do not yet have the reconstruction of the final hours, the granular, minute-by-minute breakdown of the body's surrender to the canyon. That requires a deeper dive into the biology of the expert victim. It requires us to look at the moss and the rust not as scenery, but as witnesses. It requires us to ask what the river felt as it rose to meet him. The mountains keep their secrets, but the camera has started to talk. The forensic reconstruction of Julian Vane's final 12 hours requires an obsession with the granular. This is the phase of the narrative truth, where the biological meets the mechanical, and the expert victim is reduced to a series of chemical reactions. At 4 a.m. on September 14, 2014, the human body begins its most desperate gambit for survival, vasoconstriction. To protect the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the body shunts blood away from the extremities. Julian's fingers, the same fingers that had designed suspension bridges and navigated Class 5 rapids, would have become cold, marble-like appendages. The forensic casual analysis of the ledge suggests he was no longer capable of operating the zipper on his dry bag. This explains why the camera remained sealed. He had completed his final act of documentation while he still possessed the narrative agency to do so. Imagine you are standing on that ledge as the pre-dawn light of the second day begins to bleed into the canyon. The air is saturated with the scent of wet stone and subalpine fir. You are experiencing the impossible discovery of your own mortality. At 6:15 a.m., the metadata of the environment changes. The storm breaks, leaving behind a sky of crystalline, mocking blue. The mountains don't explain why the rescue helicopters were grounded 40 miles to the south, by a fog bank that didn't exist in Julian's Canyon. The grieving investigator notes this discrepancy in the flight logs. Visibility, 0. For Julian, looking up, the visibility was infinite. He could see the path home, but he could no longer walk it. The rule of irony is at its most cruel here. The weather he needed to be found only arrived once he was too weak to signal. The evidence log of the ledge includes several small piles of stones Julian had arranged. These weren't random, they were surveyor's marks. Even as his mind began to succumb to the clouding effects of advanced hypothermia, his professional instincts remained. He was measuring the sun's shadow. He was trying to calculate his exact position for a rescue that would arrive 10 years too late. At 8:30 a.m., the slow burn pacing of his life reached its final movement. The narrative truth is found in the way he was found. He was leaning against the limestone wall, facing east. He had used the silver emergency blanket not just for warmth, but as a signal mirror, propping it up with his one remaining boot. He had turned himself into a beacon. No signal, no trace, just the reflection of a sun that no one was looking for. The grieving investigator asks, why would he keep fighting after the boat was gone? The answer lies in the character of the expert victim. For Julian, survival wasn't an emotion, it was a technical requirement. To stop fighting would be a failure of engineering. At 10:45 a.m., the timestamp pacing of the tragedy hits a wall. This is where the voice memos ended. This is where the metadata of the soul stops recording. The documentary essayist looks at the macro shots of the moss that had begun to grow over Julian's gear by the time the searchers reached him in 2025. The moss doesn't care about his credentials. The rhetorical echo of the forest is one of total indifference. The reconstruction now turns to the metadata of the camera itself. Forensic specialists discovered that the camera had been turned on one final time at 11:20 a.m. on September 14th. No photo was taken, no video was recorded, but the sensor was active for 3 minutes. This is the open loop that haunts the investigation. Was he trying to take one last photo of the horizon? Or was he simply holding the device, feeling the slight mechanical warmth of the battery as it drained into the cold air? The grieving investigator prefers to believe it was a gesture of companionship. In a place of absolute silence, the hum of a processor is a voice. At 1 p.m., the shadows in the canyon begin to lengthen again. For Julian, this would have been the final sunset. The forensic image of the ledge shows that he didn't fall, he didn't slip, he simply stayed. The narrative truth of the wilderness is that it rarely offers a dramatic climax. It offers a slow, quiet exit. The macro shots of dirt, moss, or rust on his wedding ring found inches from his hand suggest he had taken it off to prevent it from slipping from his thinning finger. He was still mitigating risk. He was still managing the evidence. The impossible discovery of 2024 was not a miracle. It was the inevitable result of Julian Vane's final meticulous project, his own legacy. He had turned his death into a cold case that could be solved. He had left a breadcrumb trail of time-stamped photos and GPS drift data that allowed the grieving investigator to find him across a decade of silence. Why did the river wait 10 years to give up the bag? The rule of irony suggests that the river wanted the story to be told only when there was no one left who could have changed the outcome. The open loop of the Vane family's grief was finally closed, but it was replaced by a different kind of haunting. Sarah Vane, now 10 years older, sat in a quiet room in Vancouver and watched the flashbulb transitions of her husband's final moments. She saw the expert victim become a ghost in high definition. The moral warning of the story is not about the danger of kayaking or the unpredictability of the weather. It is about the terrifying durability of data. Julian Vane is gone, but his 11:22 a.m. panic is preserved forever in a silicon chip. The narrative truth is that we are the first generation that can watch our loved ones lose a fight with the elements in real-time metadata. The mountains keep their secrets, but the digital age has made those secrets much louder. As we move into the final reconstruction, we must look at the impact of this discovery on the wilderness itself. The ledge is now a site of justice through memory. Hikers who pass through the Skeena tributary now look up at the limestone walls and see not just rock but a documentary essayist's map of human endurance. The slow pans over weathered objects in the forensic report have become the new liturgy of the canyon. The expert victim has been found, but the grieving investigator is left with one final question. At 2:15 p.m. on September 14, 2014, the camera recorded a final shutter click that resulted in a corrupted file. The data is a mess of static-filled archival noise, but within that noise, the forensic team found a single clear frequency. It was the sound of a whistle. Julian was still signaling. Even as the void was closing in, he was reaching out. The mountains don't explain why he kept whistling into the wind, and they don't explain why the wind didn't carry it to a human ear. They simply keep their secrets. The reconstruction is almost complete. The narrative truth is laid bare. Julian Vane was a man who did everything right in a world that doesn't care about being right. The final phase of the reconstruction moves away from the ledge and into the laboratory, where the grieving investigator seeks a finality that nature refuses to provide. The forensic analysis of the expert victim concludes not with a body, but with a forensic image of the spirit. In late 2025, the digital forensics team utilized a process called deep packet bit recovery to examine the corrupted file from 2:15 p.m. on Julian's final day. What they found was not an image of a person, but a final, unintended recording of the canyon floor from the camera's perspective as it sat in the open dry bag. It shows a macro shot of a single purple alpine flower trembling in the draft of the river below. No signal, no trace, just a flicker of life against the gray limestone. This is the narrative truth that the documentary essayist must confront, that the most prepared man in the province died looking at a weed. The rule of irony suggests that Julian's obsession with high-end gear and structural integrity was a shield against the realization that he was always fragile. The evidence log is now closed. The items, the broken paddle, the silver blanket, the single boot, have been returned to Sarah. They sit in a box in her garage, a collection of weathered objects that no longer serve a purpose. The grieving investigator realizes that the physical evidence is just a proxy for the man. The slow burn of the decade-long mystery has ended, but the open loop of the human experience remains. Why do we go into these places? Why do we pit our metadata and our carbon fiber against the static-filled archival footage of the prehistoric world? The mountains don't explain why, but they provide the theater for the attempt. Imagine you are Sarah Vane holding that camera today. You are not looking at the megapixels or the sensor size. You are looking at the last things your husband's eyes ever saw. You are standing on that summit with him, looking down at the river that took everything. The forensic storytelling has provided a justice through memory, but it has also provided a permanent high-definition scar. The moral warning is the final timestamp in this narrative. There is no such thing as a controlled environment in the wild. You are only ever a guest of the elements, and your expertise is merely a way to delay the inevitable. Julian Vane did not die because he was careless. He died because he was human in a place that is not. The rhetorical echo of the Skeena River continues to pull at the silt, slowly burying the memory of the searchers and the investigators. The impossible discovery of the dry bag was a fluke of gravity and timing, a brief glitch in the mountain silence. As the cold case essayist closes the file, the flashbulb transitions of the final photos fade to black. The macro shots of dirt, moss, or rust are all that remain of the structural engineer who thought he could calculate the river. The narrative structure of his life was an iterative forensic reveal that ended in a black frame, no signal, no trace, just silence. The mountains keep their secrets, but for a brief moment they let us see Julian Vane one last time, sitting on a ledge, waiting for a sun that had already set. The grieving investigator turns off the monitor. The expert victim is home. The river remains. The mountains don't explain why, and perhaps they never needed to. We are the ones who need the story. The wilderness just needs the space.